believe that this is being knowingly done. I also believe that in the kind of chaos that the state of Israel has allowed itself to decline into, they probably are not thinking very much about the fact that all of these toxicities will in fact flow back into their own bodies. And I think this is something well worth people becoming alert to. Because, we have to, as ecologists, we have to think about flows. We have to think about the fact that water doesn't just move in one direction. It doesn't move from the state of Israel into the blockaded territory of the Gaza Strip. Water, moves, it cycles around, it moves up and down all the time. It moves into the air, and particles of toxins are easily airborne. We know this from studies of pesticide dispersal, for instance, in other contexts. We also know that the state of Israel often deploys pesticides and herbicides deliberately on the border that it's created between itself and the Gaza Strip on days when the wind is blowing to the west, so that toxicity will affect the crops. So there's an element of this, yes, of course, that's self-destructive for the Jewish state, or the wannabe exclusively Jewish states. But the thing is that in the heat of war, people don't think about these things. And the military-industrial complex that we are caught up in, all of us are caught up in all the time, that's constantly trying to divide us from one another, that's constantly trying to tell us that there are differences between us, and that, one sect or one viewpoint or one religion is somehow better than another. All of these divisive narratives come from a place that ignores where we actually live. That we actually live on a planet that's completely connected. Everything on this planet is connected to everything else. The fact that this mind-blowing destruction that Gaza is being subjected to has released emissions equivalent to the 20 smallest countries on Earth in the last 7 months should alarm us all tremendously, because we know what the causes are of global heating. We know that that global heating is caused by the release of greenhouse gases or carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and we know that military violence is a massive, massive contributor to this superheated, carbon dioxide overloaded atmosphere that we're all breathing. So it is all connected to us. When the kids on the street chant, in our millions, in our billions, we are all Palestinians. This is really, I'm not sure if they consciously know that this is what they mean, but this is what they mean. We are all breathing this disease. We're all breathing this sick air of military toxins. It's all going to come into us at some point. And it'll be very interesting to hear if you get any feedback to this show, or whether when I first spoke to this paper on Saturday at an event for Palestinian solidarity organized by Fossil Free South Africa, so many people came up to me afterwards and said, gee, now that you've said it, I can see this everywhere around me. Somebody was telling me she's from Canada, from the tar sands in Alberta, and she was saying that she's been noticing a year-on-year decline in the fertility of cattle. It's a big cattle ranching area. And she said she's been wondering why, and whether there is some kind of connection to the incredible environmental toxicity of open-cast oil farming that they're doing there, fracking oil collection. And suddenly, when I spoke to her about what's going on in Palestine, or when she heard me speak, she said it sort of landed in her own mind, her own observations. Another person came and spoke to me and said that she had been considering whether her own child's ADHD or autism was somehow connected to exposure to toxins that she believed she'd been exposed to during the course of her pregnancy. And of course, all of these observations are accurate, and the medical literature bears them out. There are pesticides and herbicides that can cross the placental barricade and that affect fetal development. Plastics kind of cross the placental barricade. We know that our endocrine systems, in other words, the hormonal systems that regulate our bodies, are becoming more and more dysfunctional. All of the terrifying right-wing propaganda that we live on an overcrowded planet and that we must control population, which is behind a lot of the violence that we see in the world today, is actually untrue. Human fertility, mammalian fertility, is declining at an incredibly alarming and very fast rate. And yes, it does show up in things like sperm motility, sperm that don't really know how to swim properly. And it does show up in extreme difficulty in conceiving, in rises in endometriosis in women, in difficulty in carrying pregnancies to term, in very small babies, underweight babies who don't thrive and who turn out later in life to have intellectual disabilities or difficulty concentrating. You know, everyone's talking about ADHD. Where does ADHD suddenly come from? It's to do with environmental toxins, and there's more and more research about this. And military toxins are a particularly evil form of this environmental toxicity because they're so targeted. And many of the much of the military equipment that the United States produces relies, for instance, on depleted uranium, which has got a shelf life of in the hundreds of billions of years. I mean, what it really all boils down to is we literally do not know what we are doing. We do not know the consequences, the longitudinal health consequences of this incredible amount of toxicity that capitalism is throwing at us into the world for the profits of the very, very few. And this is a call to action. You know, maybe you feel like you're not Palestinian in the sense that bombs are being dropped on you right now, but this is a call that all Muslims around the world must rise up and become environmental activists. This is a call to awareness that our own bodies are being destroyed for this profiteering system that's killing us all. Why are we participating in it? Why are we allowing our water bodies to become clogged with toxins and plastics? Plastics break down into microplastics. Microplastics are ingested by fish and by birds, and they bioaccumulate. We eat those fish. We get the toxins into us. Why are we doing this to ourselves? It goes against everything. It goes against everything that the Prophet himself, peace be upon him, has told us about taking care of the world, taking care of our bodies, taking care of this beautiful, delicate ecosystem in which we live.
Yeah.
So,
you know, Vanessa, the Israeli regime, by all accounts, is just unscrupulous. And, you know, depending on what media you read and how you want to analyze the regime, they are crazy enough to even kill their own people and target their own people. And, you know, looking at things like the Hannibal Directive and those types of things, you know, if they are foolish enough and crazy enough to even target their own people and looking at, you know, killing children and women and no sanctity of life, is it then not impossible to think that this poisoning and these reproductive issues it is by design? You know, I know we're looking at environmental factors, but they are a nuclear nation. You know, they have access to nuclear power, and who oversees them? We don't know if they are dumping their nuclear waste in the water. We don't know what they're doing because, you know, the media is not allowed to report freely on what they're doing. So there's a lot going on there, and perhaps the study needs to be connected to the view from Israel because, as you point out, they even dump toxins along the border when the wind blows in a certain direction. Pesticides. So this is not an accident. You know, this is design.
Yeah, indeed. And it's all part of the Hasbara, the propaganda campaign. I mean, the Israelis have been extremely efficient at selling a sort of greenwashed version of themselves. You'll remember that when we were about to become the day zero city, there was all this talk about desalination. And the Israelis have been selling themselves as the global experts on desal. But in reality, when you look at water use patterns across historic Palestine, what they do is they over-extract, they pollute, and they steal water. The Golan Heights is a watershed That's the reason the Israelis cling to it so much, the militarily occupied Golan Heights, which really territorially belongs to Syria. So, yes, there's a huge degree of lies that are told. I mean, it's a settler colony. It's the very same as South Africa. Remember how we were always told, or we grew up with the story that, South Africa was an empty land with nothing in it. And along came these wonderful people from Europe who built it all up into what it is today, right? We all grew up with that apartheid mythology. And now we're living in a city, in a wetland city, where all of this apartheid engineering is falling apart. Concrete has a shelf life.
Right.
Concrete doesn't last forever. It starts to fall apart. And when it does, it becomes very toxic.
Yeah.
But all these things that are built are, built for the future, and they're always progress, and they're always about, how much better the Europeans are, the Americans are than everybody else, how much cleverer. And the Israelis have been very, very good at grabbing hold of all of that propaganda. So they, as a settler colony, they keep telling the story of how they greened the desert. Complete nonsense. The state of Palestine has two quite distinct parts to it. There's a rain shadow part, which doesn't get much rain at all and is very dry. And there's an incredibly fertile piece of it that runs down to the Mediterranean Sea, which is where the Gaza Strip is. It's famously fertile. I mean, it's the land of milk and honey in the ancient
Right.
Bible of the ancient Hebrew Bible. So, the settler colonies have to be, when you take over someone else's land, you have to deny them any kind of connection with their land, and you have to lie about how they take care of that land, and you have to insert yourself as somehow an ecologically superior steward of that land. And the Israelis have created that story everywhere. But it's no different from the story we know in South Africa. It's no different from the story Canadians are told, or Americans,
Right.
or Australians. They're all these empty land mythologies. It's the same script. And what it does is it tells all of us, I mean, we're such an interesting city, Cape Town, because we're also a hybrid community. Some of us came here, some of our ancestors came out here fleeing a starving Europe. That's my ancestry. Some of our ancestors came here because they were enslaved by Europeans. And some of our ancestors, go back thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So the question we all should be asking ourselves is, how do we live here collectively? How do we live here in love and compassion for one another's ancestral suffering and our contemporary suffering? And how do we live in the most biodiverse city on earth with respect to its creator, where we really take our prayers into our own bodies and into our own landscapes?
Yeah.
And how do we insist on a green Gaza? Because even the Israelis are going to run out of energy, they're going to run out of steam, and goodness knows, maybe somehow there will be some kind of organized response from other Arabic-speaking nations.
Yeah, that response, Vanessa, is the response that's lacking, and I think that's the response that the world is waiting for. The world far
part
from
of the divisiveness.
Yeah, but look, before the current assault had happened, before this this devastation,
escalation.
Gaza had at least 9 or so fertility clinics, right? And this indicated the degree to which the reproductive health was already well known, and families, were struggling, and pregnancies, were difficult, and I think by all accounts they had been looking after roughly 5,000 embryos, and it looks like every single one of those embryos are now have been destroyed. I can't say murdered. I would say destroyed.
Yeah, targeted precision bombing. So, all of you know about how precise they can be when they want to be. The largest fertility clinic, the one that stored the embryos in cold storage there, and there were about 5,000 embryos, that was deliberately and precisely targeted right near the beginning of this this escalated onslaught, roughly in December of last year. And the entire medical system has been destroyed. But yes, just imagine what that represents for people. This is people who have desperately saved up all their money and gone through the terrifying and unpleasant process of having eggs extracted and sperm extracted and embryos created, using reproductive assistance. And these were future babies that people were hoping one day to be able to have. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've seen more than one person mourning over the body of a child who was their 5th or 6th attempt at a pregnancy. Some people have miscarried 5 or 6 babies before they'd had the baby that was torn from them in this genocidal violence. I mean, the effects on reproductive health are just harrowing. There's no other way. I mean, it's difficult for me to even speak without my voice wanting to seize up with tears. This is people's entire future. The blessing of being a mother, the blessing of being a father, the blessing of being a sibling, of being a grandparent. All of this is being torn away from people. And yes, indeed, these are people who've increasingly over nearly 20 years of deliberate malnourishment, deliberate exposure to toxins at every turn, of deliberate escalation of violence, of even there was a trade into Palestine, into the Gaza Strip before October of drugs that people were taking to try and dull the terrible pain of living under a permanent military siege. All of these were having impacts on people in terms of violence, in terms of increased dissent and disharmony inside family life. Again, this is all familiar to us in Cape Town. We are all living with this kind of incredible manufactured toxicity and violence. And it's really easy for us to empathize with the horror that Gazans are facing when we start to look around at our own communities that have been destroyed by the refusal of the authorities to deal with all of these things that cause violence. I mean, gun violence, all of these guns, where are they coming from that we're afflicted by? Where are all these drugs coming in from that our communities are afflicted by? Why is nothing being done, apparently, to control these flows? And, when you look at our sort of small and special city and what's happening here, and then you look at the scale of the horror that's being inflicted on Gaza, the difference is in the scale. But the impetus behind it, the thinking, the ideologies, the politics, the cruelty that lies behind it, to me, are really all on a continuum. And we should be very, very, very frightened of why we are being turned into people who hate each other, blame each other, turn on each other, throw rubbish into each other's backyards. I mean,
yeah.
Why are we agreeing?
Yeah, you're pointing out a human phenomena or a human fallacy. We are the same around the world. We are just in different circumstances. We react to fear the same way. We react to prejudice and discrimination the same way, some more than others. But at the end of the day, are we really that different? I suppose, regarding the genetics, there's a part of our code that is so base and so fundamental that we tend to do the same things sometimes. And how we oppress each other doesn't really change around the world, just the colors do. Vanessa, it was good having you on air this morning with us. Thank you for your analysis. Please do have a pleasant rest of the day. That is Vanessa Farr. She's a research fellow at Sheffield Hallam University's Helena Kennedy Center for International Justice.
This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.